Hi, my name is Amy, and welcome to my channel. Hi, so here I am doing my first installment of reviews and things on this channel, and some episodes will be reviews of individual books, some will be sort of groups of books that I'll be looking at, sort of as a thematic type thing, sometimes films or podcasts or, whatever takes my fancy. And at the moment, I'm actually combining these two. This episode is coming out on the 1st of May, aka May Day, and that seems entirely perfect for releasing an episode on The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. Both the book and I'll talk a bit about the series, which is currently on Hulu in some parts of the world, Disney Plus in places such as the UK, where I am. Although we're not done yet with the series, it's releasing every Wednesday at the moment, so I may well have to do something when the Testaments finishes, either as a series, a standalone series, or as a season one, depending on whether or not it is going to continue into a second season, or if they're just going to do the whole thing in one, the whole book in one season. And it's at this point, I don't think they've said yet that there's going to be a second season. I haven't seen anything that suggests this. And of course, with the Hulu Disney series, The Handmaid's Tale, the first season of that was the book, The Handmaid's Tale. Isn't that a cool? I love this version, or this copy of it, complete with this really cool paper on the inside. Oops, hit the microphone there. Actually, this cover is quite cool as well. And then, yeah. Sorry, I love that kind of stuff. Yeah, so the series of The Handmaid's Tale, the first season was just the book, The Handmaid's, and then it went past that. And in fact, my understanding is, having done a bit of reading on this, that according to Margaret Atwood herself, if it weren't for the Hulu stroke Disney series, The Handmaid's Tale, we wouldn't have the Testaments. That it was the series as it carried on past season one, and in particular Anne Dowd's performance as Aunt Lydia, that inspired her to write the Testaments. And now there are some real differences between the book and the series. I'll talk a little bit about that, but the first thing I'm going to talk about is why I'm talking about the Testaments. After all, I've said in my introduction to this channel, there's another short video that I'm also releasing on the same day, May Day. And May Day, of course, in case you're like, why does that have anything to do with the Testaments and The Handmaid's Tale? May Day is the name for the insurgency that is fighting against Gilead and is working to overthrow Gilead. So that's the connection there. But if you're wondering why on earth I'm talking about The Handmaid's Tale or the Testaments, either one, given that I've said that this is going to be a channel devoted to horror, the paranormal, Gothic, those kinds of things, that is because I would argue that The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments both are Gothic. Now, this is probably a slightly controversial opinion. Bear with me, though, I will explain. Though I'm not the only one, certainly a reviewer of the Testaments for, I believe, the Daily Telegraph, actually said that she saw the Testaments as being practically Gothic. But it's possibly controversial because certainly they are, both of the books can easily be classified as dystopian, um, more often than not dystopian feminist. Um, and that's dystopian, tends to be linked as a genre with science fiction, for better or worse. Now, Atwood herself, in an interview, I think in around 2005, would go to some lengths to kind of differentiate between dystopian and, science fiction and speculative fiction. And in doing so, implies that The Handmaid's Tale, which was the only one of these that existed at the time, is speculative rather than dystopian. Speculative rather than science fiction. However, it is also worth noting that The Handmaid's Tale was the first ever winner in 1987. It was the first ever winner of the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Science Fiction Novels. And I forget who it was. Someone supposedly joked that Atwood had been trying to distance herself from science fiction ever since she'd won the Arthur C. Clarke. I'd say that's probably not true or fair, because it's not my go-to genre, though there are plenty of science fiction films and books that I do like. Um, but and there are science fiction elements to The Handmaid's Tale, particularly when you think about it's being published in 1985, and it contains references to technologies that now we're quite used to. The idea of sort of sensors reading things, CompuTalks, where you can talk to someone and see them, um, talking to people over the computer. At least that's how I always interpreted the CompuTalk. Um, there are things about it that feel very digital in their world that obviously, and as someone who was around in 1985, I was a kid, but I was around. Yes, the digital existed, but we were still living in a very analog world. For most of us on a day to day, we're entirely analog with very little interaction with the digital. And Offred's world, at least the some of the aspects of it that she's able to access, are digital. Although, of course, there's no literacy. Women are kept from that kind of thing. But it is definitely feminist, and I think that is one of the reasons why we can also argue that the Testaments and its predecessor, its mother, The Handmaid's Tale, is Gothic. And I personally, as a woman, I would argue that the world we are living in today, a world in which books like The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments have become even more relevant than maybe they were back in, say, 1985 when The Handmaid's Tale was first published. I would say the world we're living in now is Gothic, particularly when you're a woman or a person of color, and especially if you're living in the U.S. But it is not confined to the U.S. It's just as is often the case, America does it a little bit bigger. Um, yes. So, the Testaments is, if you haven't read it, and I definitely, absolutely recommend you read it. I have both read it when it first came out. I pre-ordered this and I got, and eagerly read it back when it first came out in 2019. I have also recently, to refresh my memory of it for this, listened to the audiobook version of it. I was just gonna sit and read it, and then I saw that Ann Dowd, who plays Aunt Lydia in the series, and is fantastic as Aunt Lydia. I mean, everybody in that show is really just excellent. But Aunt Lydia, Ann Dowd, who plays Aunt Lydia, also performs Aunt Lydia's role in the audiobook version of the Testaments. And yes, Aunt Lydia is one of three primary characters in the Testaments. The other two, let me just pull up this because they have multiple names. The other two characters that we hear from are a young girl who has, or a young woman who has grown up in Gilead. She was born before Gilead is established, but she has no real memories, only very faint, very hazy memories of a time before Gilead. And her name is Agnes, or Agnes Jemima. Later in the book, she will be known as Aunt Victoria, because, small spoiler, she does decide that she wants to become an aunt, which is a role, a job in this society. They're the only group of women who are actually allowed to read and write, and she, in fact, has to learn to read and write in order to become an aunt, because she has grown up illiterate, because that is required of women in Gilead. She is also referred to as Witness 369A, because the reason this book is called The Testaments is it's made up of effectively three documents. A secret autobiography, memoir, however you want to put it, that Aunt Lydia has written and has hidden away in a book. She's taken a book and, the old trick of cutting out a section in it and then hiding her manuscript inside of it. So we hear from Aunt Lydia in the first person, telling her side of things and sort of how she comes to become an aunt in Gilead. We also hear, as I say, from Agnes, as a testimony that she is giving, as a witness testimony that she is giving about her life in Gilead, and she's being asked to reminisce on what her childhood was like, what she remembers about it, sort of Gilead ways and things like that. And then we also hear, and this is the other witness statement that we get, the other testimony that we get, and this is from, and hers is the most complicated in terms of names. When we first meet her, her name is Daisy. She, and we later learn, small spoiler, that she is the long-lost baby Nicole who was spirited away from Gilead in infancy, and Gilead has been demanding her return ever since. And she is also, into the spoiler bit, witness 369B, being asked to give her testimony of when she goes into Gilead on behalf of, or as a Mayday operative, even though she's very young. She's only about 15 years old. She's 16. The action begins on her 16th birthday, or the sort of main jumping off point begins on her 16th birthday. The inciting action, that's the word. And so she is still very young, and as far as, why would they send a 16-year-old in to do sort of dangerous undercover or underground work? Because it's a war, and because they're desperate, and because she can do it, and because also there's the sort of coup of who she is, who her background is, so secret that even she didn't know about it until she turned 16. And, and so we get this story of what Gilead is like and how Gilead is finally destroyed, both from within and without. And it is Gothic because we get the stories of these women being held in so many ways against their will, and even though they manage in their own ways each to find a degree of agency, they are still very confined by the fact that they are women, and they are trapped within a world, within a place, Gilead, that is incredibly hostile, incredibly dangerous. It is an intensely uncanny place because there's so much about it, and I think particularly reading this as a person, a woman in the early 21st century, we're still, I think 2026 is still early 21st century, speaking as a historian. It is still or it is a place that is intensely uncanny because there is so much about it that is familiar and recognizable, but rendered in a very strange, odd, off putting, disturbing way. The uncanny, particularly as it's usually defined by Sigmund Freud's paper, The Uncanny, and also Ernst Jentsch, who was actually the first one to do work on the uncanny, and Freud's famous paper, The Uncanny, is actually riffing on and referencing Ernst Jentsch's paper. I've read both, and I kind of like Jentsch's paper better, to be honest, but Freud's paper is still fascinating. They're both easily accessible online for free, and they're worth reading. But they talk, for both of them, the idea of the uncanny, the unheimlich or unheimliche, is the thing, essentially, it boils down to the thing which should be familiar but isn't. And that is Gilead, because it is as we would now describe it here in 2026, it is a Christo-fascist, theocratic nation that has supplanted the United States. It doesn't take up all 50 states. There are places that are not part of Gilead that were part of the United States that have broken off and formed their own countries. We have a character, for instance, whom Daisy meets in Toronto, where she has grown up, and he identifies himself as having grown up in the Republic of Texas, which is in Texas becomes a republic, then joins the United States, and apparently in this world has gone back to being a republic. We get hints that other parts of what was once the United States are either sort of neutral zone territories in this war that has been going on throughout Gilead's existence, or parts, states that have broken away and formed their own nations, or their own sort of little clusters of states into nations. And so the country is uncanny. We don't really know how it's comprised entirely. We don't understand its, sort of makeup in that sense. It is calling itself a Christian nation, and there's constant references to God and to, holiness and piety and purity and all of that. But as is so often the case with a lot of the people who are so vehemently conservatively Christian, their faith has little to nothing to do with Christianity, with the teachings of Jesus Christ. It is entirely devoid of the actual teachings of love and acceptance and brotherhood and turning the other cheek and welcoming the stranger, feeding and taking care of the poor, the sick, the needy. It is a brutal, harsh place. And they have things like, in addition to sort of the religious elements like the Pravaganzas, these big sort of religious festivals, presumably, they also have these things called particicutions, where groups of women, usually handmaids, will execute someone who has been sentenced to death by literally ripping him to shreds with their bare hands. I'm thankful that I cannot imagine how one would actually physically rip another human being to shreds with your bare hands. I hope never to know how that would actually go down. But it is seen as both a way to get rid of enemies of the state and criminals, and as a kind of safety valve, a release for the pent-up angers and frustrations and hostilities that the women who are being forced into these very narrow roles within society, and in particular the role of handmaid, because you are effectively, I think Offred describes it in The Handmaid's Tale as a womb on two legs or something like that. So it is this very just dangerous, threatening, brutal society where, and this is something in particular the series is very good at pointing out, everything looks so pretty. And they like to talk about how much cleaner their air is, how much purer their food and their water are, how much, how much more wholesome everything is in Gilead, as long as you don't look too hard, as long as you don't peer, through the curtains at the wrong time or look around at the wrong time. It is a very dangerous place as long as you don't, but you don't see it if you don't want to see it. And it masquerades itself to a degree, but at the same time, there is really no way to avoid it completely. And as I say, the series, I think I was saying I may have had to edit out a big section because suddenly there was an engine revving and then a dog barking. Anyway, the perils of recording in an office in your house, with a window right there. But anyway, the um, the series is very good at showing this, particularly because, I mean, obviously, television, film, these are visual media that, books, and nothing against books. I adore books. You can do other things with books that you can't do with a TV series or a film. But of course, these are visual media, and so you get to show the beauty, the perfection, the perfectly appointed trays, of perfectly decorated or perfectly arranged trays of perfectly decorated biscuits, the beautifully appointed homes, the, just how exquisite everything is. And into this orderly world, you also have the threat of the wall literally hanging over people's heads. And in this beauty, yet even though it's such a beautiful world that so prides itself on its beauty and its perfection, which are actually also tenets of certain Christian cults and sects and high demand groups, and this idea of perfection in a kind of physical way, that we do see in certain groups within modern conservative, we'll call it Christianity. You also have this horrible ugliness, the series, after we see how lovely everything is and the lovely young girls coming into school and all of that in their perfect and color coded dresses. Everything, everybody's color coded, particularly the women, it seems, in this society, by the clothing, the very covered, modest clothing they wear. But when Daisy first arrives at the school, and there are real differences between timelines and ages of the characters, so that Daisy and Agnes are actually very close in age in the series, unlike the book, where they are, Agnes is several years older than Daisy, about 7 years, I think, older than Daisy. Um, One of the first things Daisy sees when she's at the school and with Agnes and some of the other commander's daughters is a man being punished. Supposedly, he has been caught staring at the girls too much and then masturbating. And as the girls stand up on a balcony looking down over him, this is in the series, um, they are asked, what should we do? And they are encouraged to start pointing and yelling, I think, punish him, punish him, punish, and they become very brutal and cruel sounding, these young girls. And they actually, in Agnes's voiceover, she comments on how, Gilead understands how cruel teenage girls can be. And so the punishment for this man is they force his arm down on a table saw, and the blade moves, spinning around, big circular saw, and it comes forward and cuts off his hand. Um, and in the series, Daisy is so horrified by this that she literally has to run away and be sick, to vomit, um, because it is so cruel. It is so disgusting. It is so horrible. And while this is not to say that, there aren't dangerous men in this world, and the girls are, as is always the case in patriarchy, women are at the greatest danger from men. Even though the men claim that the whole point of patriarchy is to protect women, ultimately they are protecting women from men. So, it just doesn't work. And so that is one of the reasons why these books and these series are seen as so inherently feminist, is they point out the very incredibly flawed nature of sort of patriarchal ideas of gender, particularly patriarchal ideas of masculinity, and why and how these are bad for everybody, and how sort of circular and nonsensical the logic of it is. But, this is an uncanny, dangerous, desperate world. So, yeah, these women are trapped as much in Gilead and trying to ultimately escape the dangers that surround them, the very masculine dangers in most cases that surround them within Gilead. Sometimes the women are dangerous too. And in fact, there is a very real argument that the only way that patriarchy survives is because there are women who are brainwashed into helping to support it. And without their support, the whole system would collapse under its own weight. But, these women that we're looking at, particularly Daisy and eventually Agnes, Aunt Lydia less so, because she is resigned to the idea that she will die in Gilead. She is an old woman by this stage. She doesn't see herself as having much time left. She certainly doesn't see herself as able to escape Gilead. But Daisy and Agnes do see that, and they are as surely trapped in there trying to escape, just like, the heroine of the Castle of Otranto. It is all very Gothic, and this sort of what is going on here, what is happening, the world, the things around me. There should be something familiar about all of this, and yet it is not. This is my home, but it has been changed. And that place that should be safe, familiar, secure, isn't. And in the world of Gilead, there is no such place. Agnes is home. We're informed very early on that the mother who she has thought of as her mother, that she believed to be her mother, Tabitha, who has died when Agnes is pretty young. She's no longer there, of course, and she now has a stepmother, Paula, who hates her and who wants to get rid of her. In fact, interestingly, at least to the point where we are now in the series, Paula is a little nicer on the show than she is in the book. And as I say, there are some changes to this, in the series. There always are changes, of course. That's part and parcel of the nature of adaptation. But so yeah, that's why I personally would argue that this is Gothic. It is inherently, fundamentally Gothic, and I would say that about both the Testaments and the Handmaid's Tale. They are linked beyond simply the role of Aunt Lydia, or the character of Aunt Lydia. As I said earlier, Atwood has said that it is Anne Dowd's performance as Aunt Lydia and, sort of how the series unfolds that inspired her to write the Testaments, which was published in 2019, by the way. I think I mentioned that earlier, but I'll say it again. And what we know more or less going into it, but particularly if we've seen the series, The Handmaid's Tale, is that Agnes is Offred June, as we know her for sure to be named in the series. Um, it is her daughter with her husband from her, that she and her husband Luke had prior to the fall of the United States, the rise of Gilead. And when Agnes is about 5 years old, is when she is taken from her mother and given away to be adopted by a commander and his wife. And this is around the same time that her June, as she is in the series, is sent to the Rachel and Leah Center, aka the Red Center, and trained to be a handmaid, to go and have babies for other for couples who are unable to have their own children, because there's a real fertility crisis. But June, we'll just call her that because it's simpler, is is obviously she is fertile. She has had a daughter, so she should be able to have other children. And of course, as we know in The Handmaid's Tale, she is not impregnated by the commander, um, later revealed to be Commander Waterford, but rather by Waterford's chauffeur, Nick. Um, so, so baby Nicole is that baby, June and Nick's child. Um, that she is called Nicole because she's not even born in The Handmaid's Tale, in the book. So that she is called Nicole, that she is spirited away to Canada, that June is not with her, and that she grows up believing herself to be a girl named Daisy, whose parents are Neil and Melanie. That all comes from, um, well, not all of that, but a lot of that comes from, and certainly the setup for that comes from the Hulu series. And although we're not introduced to Neil and Melanie until the Testaments, but the idea that she has been spirited out of Gilead as a baby and grows up in Canada, and that June has had to leave her behind. And the only reason that she leaves her baby Nicole in Canada and goes back to Gilead is, well, there are two reasons. She obviously wants to overthrow Gilead. She wants revenge on what Gilead has done to her and to her family. But also, and especially, and she says this very clearly in the series, she cannot leave Gilead without her older daughter, her first daughter. So, I mean, on the one hand, as far as spoilers, I hate to, I don't want to spoil the Testaments, the novel, because it is only, 7 years old. Um, yeah, 7 years old. The Handmaid's Tale, as I say, it's published in 1985, so it is 41 years old now. Um, yeah, 41 years old. So I'm less worried about spoiling it, and so I haven't really taken a lot of care with that. As I consider the moratorium on spoilers to be about 30 years. If you've had time to go and see it or read it or whatever by then, and if you haven't, you've probably more or less heard bits about it by then anyway. I don't think I've spoiled it too much though. I think you still got plenty to discover in that. If you haven't read either of these books, absolutely go and read them. They are both award winning. As I say, The Handmaid's Tale was the first ever recipient of the Arthur C. Clarke Award. They are both genuinely great novels, and Atwood is an incredible writer. Um, if you've only seen the series, definitely read the books. Honestly, if you've only read the books, I say go and watch the series. They are incredibly well done. I will say there is also a film that was done, I think, around 1990 or thereabouts. I'll put that on the screen here. Um, Starring Natasha Richardson. And it's not a bad film. If you can find it and watch it, it's worth watching. But the series, the series really, not only is it incredibly powerful, and Elizabeth Moss as Offred, as June, is fantastic. Um, as I say, everybody in this series is absolutely incredible. But because of the way it takes it forward in time, and the sort of the fight back against Gilead, which is, incredibly cathartic in this day and age, makes it definitely worth watching, because it takes the initial setup of the novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which is covered in season one, and it goes beyond that. And the Testaments, as I say, now that it's a series, it's picking up where, well, about 15 years or thereabouts after The Handmaid's Tale has left off, 15, 16 years, and um, the novel, The Handmaid's Tale, has left off, and is, bringing it all to a close, effectively. Um, so, yeah, that's everything I have to say about it. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I promise I'll get better at all of this as I get used to doing it. But this is my first episode, so yeah, I'll learn. I'm already learning some. So thank you very kindly. Go and read the Testaments, and I will see you next Friday, for another book. Bye.